and welcome to another edition of the Umoja Circle. My name is Keith Smokey Johnson, and I'd like to welcome you to, the second part of a very powerful discussion that was started by myself and my guest, Brother Born Logic Allah, co-founder of Melanize Media, along with his partner, Baba Anda Ma'at. And we were talking about the topic of the show that we started in part one of this discussion, had a lot to do with the role of community. We talked about in the first show why we need a sense of community. This portion of the discussion, like I said at the beginning of the first show, to deal with any problems on this planet, on this earth, you have to understand the history of how it got to this point. Okay, you cannot understand how to fix a problem unless you understand the history behind it. And before we can start the discussion, I would like to say, for those of you who are new to the show, the purpose of the Umoja Circle is to correct errors where errors are found and to introduce facts where we find that so many people are working on fiction when it comes to who we are as people of African descent. And only through true and accurate dialogue and historical facts that are presented can there be a shift in consciousness. And when there's a shift in consciousness, there is a shift in your world's view. We left off in the middle of our conversation about the role and necessity to maintain and develop and protect Black communities, or any community. The role of a community, it has three components. You must first have in this culture, we have to maintain our, and I don't have it in any particular order, but one of them, you have to have a cultural awareness. You must have a common knowledge of your common origin knowledge. You know, a common direction that you as that group has. And you have to have a common interest in developing and enhancing that group status. All people do that. And how a culture is started, that there is an original group, you know, landing on a particular land or being kidnapped and brought like we were 500 years ago to this Western world. And that group found common origin, the west coast of Africa. They might have been from different ethnic groups, but they saw that under the same conditions that they had to work together, all right? Common direction, common to survive.
Indeed.
And then from there, the actions that were developed for that survival based on the environment that we're in. You're in a hostile land where people are telling you can't speak your tongue. That we would take it off our linguistic terms, our cultural terms, our historical terms, all those things we would try to force, as they were called, seasons out of us, you know, which really you can never do, but you could not express those terms other than what the dominant group had. And for English America, that started in Jamestown in 1619. In fact, we're in 2019, and in August of this year is the 400th anniversary when those 25 or 30 enslaved people who were kidnapped twice made it to the shores of Virginia at Point Comfort in 1619. And ever since then, we were under certain kind of hostile conditions where we could not express what the true freedom is, the realities of us being of African descent. And the actions of those people that we call our ancestors becomes their experience, right? They have children, and their children have children, and that experience becomes the history to those children and their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren, and 18 generations later to us. and that continual history that's become inculcated into your thought process and becomes your culture. So you have the actions that's shaped by what you have to survive and do to survive, Some behavior does not still work for us now as people of African descent, but it was part of our survival in 1600, 1700, 1800, or going into the 1900s. But if we don't understand that history, then those behavioral patterns that prevent us from concentrating our wealth in a community, developing our community, even though we've done it instinctively, automatically, and not understanding the obstacles that were placed in front of us, we have to understand that, like you said, the knowledge of that before we can work to fix these issues. Without that knowledge, we're just grasping at straws. You know, I know I was a little long on my intro, but what do you have to say about this, you know, the points that I made about our history?
Yeah, we have to know our history. If not, we don't understand the failures of the past, and we just keep repeating the
Doomed to
cycle.
repeat them, exactly.
So we have to understand what has happened so we can take different routes in the future.
When I talk to kids about this topic, and those are always the people that I try to do, and I try to say it in a way, because I'm no expert. I love history, is my passion, but it's more of a hobby, but it's who I am, and that's why I do this show. And I recognize the importance of history. I always ask them when they kind of eyes roll in their head, and you know they you know, there's a reason why we as people of African descent think that history is boring, or
That's a
that
societal problem. It's not.
But this show focuses on our people.
But what I want to say specifically, a lot of times we don't see ourselves in the history. That's why we don't have
Exactly, and that's the part of those are some of the issues of why we do like that. You're right, because the society at large, the dominant white society, made it so. It's not coincidental. That's my point. It's not coincidental that we don't understand our history, or we don't. That's the social engineering aspect I'm talking about, where our thought processes are shaped. And one of the ways that you shape our thought process, you stop at a red light automatically, right? I stop at a red light, and all the people out there stop at a red light. But 200 years ago, nobody had an idea when you talk about a red light. We didn't have that conditioned response. What caused us to stop at a red light? Wasn't there a law that was written? People follow that law. And like I said earlier, when you have certain actions and you continue to have a certain behavioral action, it becomes inculcated. You're born into that society where you got to follow that law. You didn't know the origins of that law, or what the first generation had. You just know that's what you did. And the next generation, and the next generation, okay? There were laws that were put in place as far back as the early 1600s that shaped how we as people of African descent were supposed to respond in this society dominated by, and there was laws that shaped how a certain white America. Many people are not familiar with the 1638 law called the Doctrine of Exclusion. Have you heard of that law? Most people haven't. We're wondering why white people have this sense of control and domination. Well, they were conditioned by laws. The Doctrine of Exclusion said that no black person should benefit from the fruits of white society. This was in Maryland. And then other colonies took up that law. So when you have a law that says no black people will be allowed, if you're the white dominant group, how do you think you're going to do carrying out that law in everyday society? Won't you be conditioned to behave a certain way? And we are conditioned to circumvent or try to deal with that kind of involvement? And you do that for generation to generation. Then you add black codes. You're going to shape a cultural issue. 10 generations later, you're going to tell them, without even understanding that history, you know, well, this is how we always do it. To this very day, when you see white people calling on black, they're coming from that white privilege. And that's where white privilege came. It wasn't no psychological, you know, theoretical nonsense. It was literally shaped by law, socially engineered. Again, if we don't understand that history, understand that when you have an engineer, what does the engineer do? They shape. There's a discipline called people who are of social, what they call social engineers, who study the behavior of people in society. So, but who you think use those laws? Government, city council, groups. You know, so this system of how black people are responding and how white people are responding, that's what I want people to understand when we come to communities, that we develop communities, but you had a population, dominant population, that destroyed those communities or put in place laws that affected, you know? How do you feel about what I just said about this history that we have to, like you said, have knowledge of first?
No, there's truth in it.
You know, it's true. If we don't understand that, you know, we came to this country, we were kidnapped, and we were forcefully, you know, immigrated in here. We are the only, to me, non-immigrants in America. We didn't immigrate to America in 1619 or 1700s. We were forced. So how can we be told to go back? You know, our history started not in 1776. Our history started in 1619. But how many people talk like that when they have these conversations? Our ideas are always shifted to, you know, trying to explain 1776. Well, that's 156 years. There's 156 years of history of shaping by laws the things that we don't do. You know, and you in your documentary, in a way, talked about using San Antonio, the Alamo City. You use history, right? You know. More about your, is there a reason that you started in 1865 with your documentary?
Yes, because we actually have a section that goes before that.
Okay.
But it got to be so
it's fast.
Large that we realized we couldn't put both in one bucket. And so we didn't feel like we could do the 1865 and before. We didn't feel like we could do it justice.
I got you.
So we pretty much took it and put it in a whole nother bucket because we realized it was a lot more than what we thought. And honestly, just the history of San Antonio from a black perspective in general, it was far bigger than what we expected. It was so much that we didn't expect.
Can you give us an example of something?
I mean, it's just when we talked about, for instance, we keep talking about the East Side. The black community didn't really start on the East Side. No, not at all. It started downtown for the most part.
Close to where we talk about
the city. Some of the first black settlements were really towards
close to the Alamo.
Downtown.
Wow.
And also the near West Side. So it was a process that people were moved to the West Side. But there's a whole history on the West Side of town. There were people in pockets of black communities on the North Side. Black people had been involved in the founding of San Antonio. So when you take it back to the first Spanish that came here, there were blacks amongst them.
Yeah, I agree.
And when we found that, I was like, that's a whole nother movie, you know, so.
And that's what I'm saying. If you don't understand that history, we don't exist in the mentality of when we have these conversations. There's always like a blank it's like an amnesiac. And when you talk to somebody, if you ever see movies with amnesia, people with amnesia, they know something is not right, but they don't have the memory to do it. How do they function? Don't they get upset?
Yeah. I think what we really, because what we started out talking about was the youth and the children. We have gone through phases, I think, in our country, for us as a people. We had the 70s where there was a super heightened awareness of history.
Let's talk about that more. Let's talk about solutions, because, you know, we only got a few minutes. And we're trying to put a whole, the same thing with what you had to deal with the documentary. This topic that we're talking about, our communities and how it was formed and how it was shaped, It's vast.
Yeah.
You know. So yes, continue on that about the group as one. As you look at it as a solution, we should start with our youth.
Oh yeah, definitely. I feel the youth are our future. You know, if we don't pass down certain things to them, it'll be lost, and that's what keeps happening. Generations miss a step, and then we have to quote unquote start over
Exactly,
again,
I agree.
when we should be passing the torch and taking that same fire and
And
letting it grow.
that's the role of wealth. There's also a wealth of knowledge. There's an economic wealth, but there's a knowledge wealth. And the thing of the definition of wealth is ownership.
Yeah.
You have the economic wealth. You got to own land and factories and buildings and all that stuff. But to have that knowledge wealth, that must be. And another thing with wealth is that it gives you the opportunity to pass it down. Okay, you pass down your car, you pass down your building, you pass down your factory to the next generation. But we must pass down that wealth of knowledge, the accurate wealth of knowledge.
Absolutely.
We're in the information age, supposedly, all this information. But if you don't have an idea, that's you could transport all kinds of information, but if you don't own the transportation or the means of transportation, the educational transportation of what you specifically want to transport, you at the whims of whoever who owns that type of communication. You know, and that's also part of the community. You know, as a person in media, there is only we're losing a lot of. In terms of communication, that is what you do. You communicate by film, you communicate by other mediums. If we don't have that access, then again, that's what was in that building I talked about in the first show, where you have economics. I know I just go over what Brother Anderson say.
Yes.
You talk, your criminal justice. You have your the economics, your politics that control the politics, and so on. But you have media was on a fourth floor, after politics, after the criminal justice stations, the communication. Because if you can't communicate, when the army conquers the land, one of the first things they do is attack the media, the communication.
Absolutely.
That's important. And a lot of the stuff sometimes I see on some of these social media platforms, some of the conversation, the information some of our people are working on that we have to correct. To me, that's the role of an elder. That's why I do this show, to try to do my little piece of hold my little piece of the complexity, and try to communicate accurate information from our perspective. You know, I still have to study every day. I'm sure you do.
Absolutely.
You know, so there's only. If you look at the Latino community, they have Telemundo, a viable communication system that expresses their cultural perspective from their point of view. You have yeshivas in the Jewish community. Whether you agree with their philosophies or not, they teach their youth a certain perspective. You have Chinatown and their cultural and their schools. In the city of New York, where I come from, Chinatown, there's about 500 people, 500,000 in that area of Chinatown. But in that area, they have something like 40 or 50 Chinese banks, culturally owned banks. They have all kinds of schools that reflect their ancient philosophies. Where we have black communities in Brooklyn and Bronx and Manhattan, we don't have none of that. We have to depend on the dominant groups of schools. You know, communicate. So we have to learn about that culture. Many people know who George Washington is, or the Constitution, but they don't talk from the perspective of the people who were serving George Washington. Where did we dominate economically around the time in Philadelphia and New York? We ran the pubs, we were the barbers. We had communities even there in Philadelphia. We had our own churches. We had our community. But what is the history of that community? Many of our people cannot really even have this kind of discussion about it. Without that knowledge, how can we solve our problems today.
Indeed.
That's the point I'm trying to make on this show. You know, and that's my concern. You know, that's what my clarion call is. What is your clarion call when it comes to community? What are the issues that you think that should, from your perspective, work?
Understanding, because like you said, we live in a knowledge world. We're in the information age, but information is knowledge. But without understanding, then we don't know how to put those things into perspective.
Don't have no strategies,
Yeah.
exactly. That's
we
why
don't know how to use it.
That's what I said. We should, just like all communities. People don't realize when we, you know, I study American history too. I study European history. I study how they came in context of how we in the society must deal with it. People don't realize what capitalism is. It's the ability to acquire land, acquire the tools to process the land and the resources of the land using other people's labor. That's the closest and the most simple definition of capitalism, okay? So you must have, and acquiring the land and owning the land and owning the tools that develop the land and having the ability to make other people work for you, their labor, to gain your wealth. And then they have the ability to transfer that wealth to future generations. That's capitalism.
Indeed.
How are we doing in that respect?
It's hard for us because we didn't create that system.
Thank you.
And it wasn't designed for
And we went left with 2% of that wealth when we were free. We were given a non-economical compensation. Do you know that there was a Civil Rights Act of 1866 that was produced by people like Thaddeus Stevens and Benjamin Butler and those so-called radical white Republicans, who said that if there is no economic compensation for the freedmen in 1865, they will remain slaves. So they came up with a Civil Rights Act that gave you that so-called 40 acres of a mule. That's where that mentality came from. But it was literally, they tried to do that. And $100 for every freedman to start off economic, because they understand the system that was created, this capitalist system. We were given nothing. It was vetoed by Andrew Johnson, that racist president, one of 11 of the first 16, who didn't have our interests.
And that's why I think the conversation of reparations really got to come up, because
Thank you.
Because it's not like this is a new idea.
No.
It was known at that time that you don't do hold people wrong for hundreds of years.
They understood it. It's in their, but how many of us were taught? How many people went to college and went to high school and had history classes and ever heard what I just said? It's no coincidence, because they're not talking about us. We have to, like you said, inform ourselves, have these discussions at dinner tables. We got to understand how the monopoly game, we are playing a literal monopoly game as a people. But we weren't given any kind of, we were just said, you're free. It's a nice word, but how does it apply literally? One of the great things about that teach me that we are fantastic people, because look at us.
We're the best.
We have doctors, we have lawyers. That's how, starting the way we started.
For us to even be here is a testimony.
Thank you, thank you. And we need to talk about that but if not, we can't depend on the school systems that so-called educators to do such a thing.
True. We have to look at ourselves in that light. And I think that's what, coming back to education, because we have to know who we are. You don't really got to look 100 years in the past to see our greatness. Just our presence right here.
The fact that we're breathing
is a testimony to who we are.
We were brought here to be a permanent working
but see,
force.
Even that, we were brought here not because we were the worst, it's because we were the best.
Thank you.
If you're going to go get somebody to do labor, if you're going to go get somebody to build your house, you're not going to get some bum who never used a tool. You're going to go get the best person possible to build your house.
And that's the mythology that we have to change. A shift. Once you have a shift, an accurate image of yourself, there is a shift in consciousness. And that's what I mean. And when there's a shift in consciousness, there's a change in the world. In order for me to go to a doctor and get treated, what do I have to have? I have to have a medical history in order for him to treats you right now. You're going to go get a loan for a business. What are you going to have to deal with? A financial history. You cannot function in the present moment without knowledge of that history, and accurate knowledge. If you put out the wrong information on your financial report, you're going to end up in jail. History and the present moment are connected, present moment. We got less than a minute now. Time just flies.
Yeah.
Any closing statement that you would like to make about our topic?
Just that people should strive to do their best to understand the history and then apply the lessons of the past to the present time.
It's a power relation that we have in this country, okay? And wealth is the determination of your true sense of equality. We have $1.3 trillion as a black community that we spend income-wise, but we still have to work on the wealth. That's the accurate concentration of power to be a viable and productive people constantly. So until next time, I hope you got something out of this. Peace, Hotep, bye-bye.